Thank you all very much for being here, and good afternoon. Welcome to our book forum on the fateful history of Fannie Mae. Fateful not only for Fannie Mae, but for everybody else too. And there are copies of the book on sale out in the reception area, which we hope you'll buy, and which Bob Hagerty will be glad to autograph after the program. I'm Alex Pollock, a resident fellow here at AEI, and we're very pleased to have you here to consider with us this fateful history and its role in American politicized housing finance. After many years of dealing with and thinking about Fannie Mae, I thought I knew a lot about the subject, but I learned a lot more about it from reading Bob's book, especially about the very long-term evolution of politicized mortgage finance in this country, and also about the vivid personalities involved over the last 40 years, all the way to the end of the story. At least it's the end so far. The book is full of information, but in addition, if you read my invitation to this event, you know that I think it represents an underlying tragic drama. In fact, a Shakespearean tragedy in 5 acts: rise, power, hubris, fall, and utter humiliation. On power, many people in Washington not so long ago, and in the mortgage business everywhere in the country, were truly afraid of Fannie Mae and the retribution it meted out to people who dared to cross it. On hubris, we had Fannie often claiming it was the center of, quote, the best housing finance system in the world, unquote. It reads so ironically in retrospect, of course. This sentiment being echoed by former Senator and Banking Committee Chairman Dodd, exclaiming that Fannie was, quote, one of the great success stories of all time, unquote. And so it was until the fall and humiliation. All 5 acts are very well chronicled by Bob's book. But which Shakespearean tragedy is this in the background behind the history of Fannie Mae? Well, thinking of the fear of Fannie, perhaps it's Richard III, with Fannie as the ruthless Richard, brought down finally upon the field of Bosworth by Henry Paulson playing Henry VII. Or thinking of then Fannie CEO Dan Mudd, as presented in the book, pathetically presenting financial plans to a Treasury Department which had already decided upon and was indeed scheduling his fate. Is it the great pathos-full abdication scene from Richard II with Dan Mudd as Richard, handing over the crown to Henry IV, played by James Lockhart? Maybe. But I think the best Shakespearean analog is Julius Caesar, with the dictator of mortgage finance cut down in the Capitol, Henry Paulson this time playing Brutus. But I'm thinking especially of the great scene where Mark Antony stands over and addresses the murdered body of Caesar. This time we have Mark Antony played by Bob Hagerty, standing over and addressing the fallen Fannie. O mighty Fannie, dost thou lie so low? Well, that's enough indulging myself with your indulgence. We're about to hear from the author of this excellent book. After Bob's presentation, we'll have comments of 10 minutes each from our discussants, whom I'll introduce at that point. Then we'll follow that with discussion, including your questions. At 6 o'clock, we'll adjourn for reception, and Bob will be available for book signing and informal discussion at that point. As you know, Bob Hagerty writes for the Wall Street Journal. He's now based in Pittsburgh and has worked as a reporter, editor, and bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal and the International Herald Tribune, in Hong Kong, London, Brussels, Paris, Atlanta, and New York. He served as managing editor of the Asian Wall Street Journal and London bureau chief for the journal. He was a member of the team that won the Distinguished Business Reporting Award for articles about the subprime mortgage crisis, and was also one of the reporters awarded the 2008 Excellence in Urban Journalism Award. He covered Fannie and Freddie for the Wall Street Journal for the eventful years of 2004 to 2010, and now he has written the very insightful and instructive book on the fateful history of Fannie Mae, which he will now discuss. Bob, we are delighted to have you here.
Thank you so much, Alex, and thank you all for your interest in this topic. I think it's really appropriate that I present my book here because the AEI was so far in front of the pack in warning of the dangers of Fannie and Freddie. Not that Congress was really listening. And it's a pleasure to be here and see so many people who kindly helped me over the years with my research. Alex, Tom, Ed, Tom Stanton, Bert Ely, others. Thank you all. I recently looked up the electronic version of my book on iTunes. And iTunes informed me that people who bought my book also bought Winnie the Pooh. Well, Winnie first appeared in 1926. Fannie Mae came along about a dozen years later, and both have proved surprisingly durable. One turned into a Disney franchise. The other became a national disaster. Despite all of their troubles, Fannie and Freddie still are responsible for most new home mortgages in the United States. So we have nationalized a huge part of our mortgage industry. How did we get to this point? Well, it wasn't on purpose. It was really more of an accident, and it was a bipartisan accident. Let's go back to the 1930s. About a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. Around half of all mortgage debt was in default. Housing starts were down about 90%. So when Roosevelt became president in 1933, the top priority was to get people back to work. Sounds kind of familiar. Building houses would be a great way to do that. But to build houses, you need bank loans. And banks were not really in the mood to gamble on real estate. So the government would try to make banks feel more secure. The Housing Act of 1934 created the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. It provides insurance to banks so that they know that they will get their money back. But even with the FHA, banks still might feel nervous. They might want somebody to buy those mortgages from them. So in that same Housing Act of 1934, Congress made provisions for a new breed of privately owned firms called National Mortgage Associations. They were to buy FHA-insured loans. There was just one problem. No private investors wanted to do it. So finally, 4 years later, in 1938, the Roosevelt administration created the Federal National Mortgage Association, which became known as Fannie Mae. It was a tiny federal agency. What private companies would not do, Uncle Sam would. This was not considered big news at the time. The Wall Street Journal buried the story on page 2, and it was only 8 sentences long. I want to point out that was before I started at the Journal. Otherwise, we would have had a bigger story, and it probably would have been on page 1. Of course, Washington created many government programs in the 1930s, and many of them are still with us. But when Dwight Eisenhower became president in 1953, he wanted to end some of those programs. Oops, this is Roosevelt signing the Act of 1934. And when Eisenhower wasn't too busy playing golf, he tried to do just that. He wanted to get the federal government out of the mortgage buying business. He proposed legislation to gradually transform Fannie Mae